What is up, good people? Stephen Kotler here, Executive Director of the Flow Research Collective. You're tuned in to more questions than answers. That's right, deep dive into neuroscience, flow, the upper possibility space of human experience, and a lot of the black holes that still exist in this research. A lot of what we do on this podcast is take old, seminal, critical, important, new, wonderful, take your pick papers on flow and peak performance and break them down, take a deeper look at them. And today, we're going to look at one of the most famous papers in flow research. It was written by Charles Limb and Alan Braun. Both of them were at Johns Hopkins when they wrote it. Charles Limb is now at UCSF. It was written back in 2008 and published in PLS One, which is a great journal. And it's called Neurosubstrates of Spontaneous Musical Performance and FMRI Study of Jazz Improvisation. So the big deal about this paper is this. Flow research had sort of been proceeding apace through the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s. A lot of people were thinking that flow was predominantly neurochemistry, endorphins, and an endorphin expert named Huda Akil, who was at the University of Michigan and the head of the American Society for Neuroscience and a brilliant researcher, but very skeptical about endorphins' ability to cross the blood-brain barrier and our ability to measure endorphins in the brain, and a whole bunch of stuff like that. Told the New York Times, Gina Kolata did an article. She said runner's high caused by endorphins is a total fantasy of the pop culture. And that had a profound effect on research. It really, neuroscience research on flow sort of shut down in America for a while. Some really great stuff started happening in Europe as a result, but it cleared away some debris. And Arne Dietrich, who was then at Georgia Tech, and is a friend of mine and a brilliant thinker on flow and consciousness and creativity, has written a bunch of great books, proposed the transient hypofrontality hypothesis, right? The idea that our prefrontal cortex and large swatches of prefrontal cortex deactivate in flow. This got proved by Charles Limb and Alan Braun in this study. So what they did in this study was a very small study. They just used 6 people, but there was a reason for this. It was an fMRI study, and what they did is they had their study subjects, who were all trained jazz musicians, play a jazz standard. So they were just playing from memory, and then they had them improv. They built a special keyboard that had no metal parts that could be fit inside an fMRI. They redid this later, by the way, with rappers, but we're only going to talk about the first study. And what they looked at is the difference between improv playing, which took place in flow, or at least a low-grade flow state, and playing standards, which just required memory and concentration. And so I want to talk about what they discovered happened to the brain in flow. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of what they found, and then we're going to sort of break this stuff down area by area. So you're about to hear a long listing of parts of the brain, what they do, and what they might have to do with flow. What I want to tell you is, even though this list is going to be long, and I'm going to be talking for a little while, if you're going to stay tuned, this is a very small picture of flow, right? We're only looking at transient hypofrontality. Other than stuff I'm going to talk about with the anterior cingulate cortex, which we'll get to, I'm going to talk a little bit about neurochemistry and neurochemistry and neuroelectricity when we talk about that structure in the brain. But other than that, we're going to sort of leave this out, and we're really not going to talk about networks very much. And there's a lot of connectivity things that we're not discussing. So even though this is going to feel like a fairly exhaustive breakdown of this paper and all the parts of the brain that are active and deactivated in flow, it's really still only a sliver of the picture. And that's, by the way, just at the kind of gross neurobiological level. We're not going anywhere near the molecular level, the genetic level. So there's a lot more going on than what we're talking about in this breakdown, but this is a great place to start. So I'm going to start sort of with an overview, and what he really found is profound deactivation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the lateral orbital frontal cortex. And he saw focal, meaning targeted acute activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. He also saw an increase in sensory motor activity and a decrease in limbic activity, right? The deactivation extends from the lateral, meaning side of the orbital frontal cortex, to the superior, meaning upper portions of the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. And dorsal, by the way, means top, above. Dorsal fin sticks out, right? So the superior portions of the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex means the top of the top, right? And it extends to the dorsal, again, portions of the medial prefrontal cortex. That's interesting. We'll come back to it. Broad increase in sensory-motor areas. Most of these are used in improvisation, things like the anterior superior temporal sulcus, the inferior temporal fusiform, and the lateral occipital gyri. We see selective activation in the ventral and dorsal premotor area, supplementary motor area, and portions of the primary motor cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex is activated, cingulate motor area, the right lateral cerebral hemisphere, and the vermis are also activated. Deactivated are the amygdala, entorhinal cortex, the temporal pole, the posterior cingulate cortex, the parietal gyri, hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. So what the hell did I just say? Okay. We're going to try to slow that down a little bit. Some of these structures we know more about than others. Some of them play bigger roles in flow than others. We're going to start with what's activated, right? We're going to start with the medial prefrontal cortex. Really good evidence that this portion of the brain, and the medial prefrontal cortex means the middle of the prefrontal cortex, the middle of the newest part of the brain, the part that's right behind your forehead that governs all kinds of higher cognitive functions. The medial prefrontal cortex, which is fired up in flow, it's one of the only parts of the prefrontal cortex that remains active in flow, is involved in selective and divided attention, right? So where we focus our attention, our ability to tune out distraction, this is important here. Short-term working memory is here, and same thing with behavioral flexibility. Right? There's a lot of dopamine that flows through this part of the brain, and if you cut off that supply of dopamine, you get cognitive defects here, attention and memory impairment. So we know that when this part of the brain is active, we also have dopamine in our system. We see the anterior cingulate cortex. Cortex is bark, right? It is a fancy way of saying bark, and it's activated. The anterior cingulate cortex, it looks like a collar, sort of, and it surrounds the corpus callosum, anterior meaning front. We also have a posterior that's in the back. This is an amazingly cool part of the brain, activated and flow. It's one of my favorite parts of the brain, and I think it houses some of the coolest mysteries about flow. So what does the ACC do? This is where we do conflict monitoring. And what I mean by conflict is not, I got in an argument with my mom. It's the brain is constantly, it's a pattern recognition system that is using the pattern it detects to predict the future, right? And if everything matches your prediction, you don't even notice. So you're reaching for a doorknob, you think the door is going to be open, you open the door, you walk on through. You don't even notice. But what your brain did is a millisecond before you reach for that doorknob, it said, oh, you're reaching for a doorknob. I predict it's going to be open, and because it's open, I predict you're going to need this much energy to open the knob, and it makes an energy calculation. That's what that prediction is about. How much energy do you need for the next moment? If you find the knob locked, right? You reach for the door, you go to turn it, it's locked. Oh crap, problem. ACC lights up, right? When you don't get the feedback you expect, this part of the brain lights up. And you can actually see this conflict in neuroelectricity. There is an EPR, an electrical spike in this portion of the brain called N400. And it literally means we're not happy because we didn't get what we expected. So this part of the brain is really involved in reward-based learnings. Do my predictions match or not? Future planning. If you get it right, you get dopamine. If you get it wrong, this is interesting, you get norepinephrine, right? Norepinephrine comes mostly from the locus coeruleus, deep in the brain, and it is very, very, it's one of the only places that norepinephrine is really hardwired is into the ACC. So if the prediction matches, right, I went for the door and the door was open, oh, cool, you get a little bit of dopamine because it encodes the memory. If it doesn't match, you get norepinephrine, anxiety. Whoa, I got to do something different. So this is cool. I talk about this part of the brain a little bit when I talk about flow for writers, because this part of the brain also shows up when we hear a word used in a weird way. Neologisms, new words. Shakespeare wrote for this. Dave Chappelle, if you've ever heard his comedy, he activates this part of the brain by talking street, but like dropping in big words. And this is, by the way, me parroting Jamie Foxx, parroting David Chappelle. But he'll do things like, that motherfucker be chartreuse. You hear chartreuse, you're like, what? Right? It just doesn't quite click. That's the ACC. This part of the brain is also about empathy and impulse control and decision making, right? Control and management of unpleasant emotions may lie here. And this is really cool. It is very correlated with effort and continued effort in the face of unpleasantness. And I think this is really important in flow. In flow, we are often doing something. For example, athletes in flow are also usually in a lot of physical discomfort, right? They're pushing themselves super hard. It hurts. We do the same thing cognitively, right? Like when we're in flow, we are maintaining focused effort, often in the face of like a hard and difficult, challenging task. This is also the only place where we have spindle cells. Von Canano neurons are what they're called. I can never pronounce his name. They're called spindle cells, by the way, because they're very long and straight. And these are found in apes and humans and no other primates. And what we think they do is they act quickly and instinctively in social situations. And they're big, fat neurons because you get really fast information transfer. The mystery with the ACC, and what's the big frickin' puzzle here, has to do with norepinephrine and dopamine and what I said earlier about error correction. So you got to think about flow as a point where we're not making a whole lot of errors, right? It's peak performance, so we're doing our absolute best. So errors don't show up. But as everybody who's ever been in flow knows, you're going to screw up sometimes, right? So you're going to get spikes of norepinephrine. What's weird about this is Herb Benson, when he kind of mapped the flow cycle and mapped the neurochemistry of flow, has argued that as soon as you get a nitric oxide release, it flushes all the stress hormones, including norepinephrine, from your system, and that it's replaced by the positive feel-good chemicals that show up in flow, dopamine and all the rest. The problem is that the minute the ACC lights up, you're going to get more norepinephrine. So Benson was definitely wrong about that, and there's a whole lot more to know about. All right, let's talk about the sensomotor areas a little bit that are activated in flow. You get the inferior temporal cortex. This does pattern recognition in the visual field, right? What that basically means is it helps the eyes detect patterns. There's a lot of face reading. The fusiform gyrus. This is also face reading and face and body recognition. So you see a friend walking towards you and you sort of recognize the outline of their body in the distance. That's this part of the brain. We do a lot of processing color information here and word recognition within category identification. So is that thing I'm looking at a face or not a face, right? That sort of stuff. And we get a lot of dopamine here. When we recognize faces, right, we get a lot of dopamine released. And if you've ever been to a foreign country, by the way, and everybody sort of starts to look familiar to you, you walk outside and you start seeing people you think you know in the crowd, but it turns out you don't know them at all. It's literally this portion of the brain hunting dopamine. It's sort of the same thing as a phantom cell phone buzz, where you think your cell phone is buzzing in your pocket because your brain wants the dopamine and it's not really buzzing. This is the same thing. This is your brain craving dopamine. You're in a foreign country, and it's doing it by trying to show you people you think you know, right? And it's amped up in flow, which is why strangers seem familiar, which might be one of the reasons flow is such a potent social bonding tool. Interesting. All right, the lateral occipital gyri, another part of the brain that does face perception, but it also seems to do something with addictive behavior and may account for the fact that it's activated or somewhat poor impulse control in flow. There's a lot of things that sort of account for this, higher risk taking in flow, things like that. This is one of those spots. It also activates the anterior, superior, temporal sulcus, right? Anterior, front, superior, top, temporal, meaning the temporal lobe, sulcus, and gyri are the folds and the ridges in the brain. And this part of the brain is implicated in social perception, right? It likes voices and stories more than environmental sounds or nonsense baby babble, right? It likes moving faces more than moving objects. And it may be part of the brain that is activated by theory of mind. When we're trying to figure out what another person is thinking, it seems to follow other people's attention and is involved in cognitive empathy and perspective taking. It's linked to selflessness, altruism, and all kinds of pro-social behavior like fairness and generosity. It helps us detect social cues, trustworthiness, intention. This is the part of the brain when it gets activated in flow. This is part of the temporal parietal junction you've heard me talk about. And the temporal parietal junction is one of the parts of the brain that does perspective shifting and perspective taking. So when perspective widens out in flow, this part of the brain is active. Also, because perspective can both be kind of interior and exterior, right? Your perspective is what you're looking at from a particular body position in space, right? So this part of the brain is also implicated and activated when we have out-of-body experiences, which is interesting. And one of the reasons we may seem to have more frequent out-of-body experiences in flow, as we talked a little bit about in Stealing Fire, is because of the temporal parietal junction, right? Also, we activate the premotor cortex. This is a lot about this basically the motor cortex and the premotor cortex. This is all about movement, right? Flow is an action state, is defined by action. We're always moving in flow. Even if you're just sort of writing and tapping the keyboard kind of thing, you tend to be moving in flow. So to do that, we activate the dorsal premotor cortex. This gives us small muscle control. You're, by the way, hearing my dogs in the background. Sorry about that. Small muscle control. It gives us a kind of a somasensory map of the body, right? And so it's like which arm do you want to use to reach for a certain thing, right? That's what this part of the brain is doing. We also get the ventral premotor cortex, and this is about receiving visuospatial signals and specifying that a spatial target was reached, right? You're reaching for a doorknob, right? Once you reach it, this part of the brain goes, boom, you got it. Both of these areas, and this is really interesting, are really thick with mirror neurons, right? They actually fire before the motor cortex begins firing. So the easiest way I can explain this is an action sports analogy. If you're skiing, if you're chasing a friend down the mountain, you often talk about it as chasing the rabbit, because you just lock in flow, and then everything else takes place automatically. It takes place automatically because your mirror neurons are mirroring the person in front of you, right? And they're locked in. So this is a part of the brain that is doing this. We see activation in the supplemental motor area. This is the planning of movement, and it's possibly movement that's planned from like kind of intrinsic motivation rather than a sensory reaction. I'm moving because I've got a goal rather than I'm reacting to something. Interestingly, if you have epilepsy in this area, right, even though it seems to be goal-oriented rather than sensory-oriented, it seems to be tied to some very primal movements or goals, right? You have a spike here, and you got a lot of laughing or kicking or pelvis thrusting, and even the fencing posture where you're waving an object in front of you, really common here. So very strange. Fencing may actually be kind of a hardwired behavior for whatever reason. We also see the cingulate motor area, which is involved in the processing of reward selection. It's really connected to the amygdala, which we'll talk about more in a second, but that's primary emotion. The vermis I mentioned earlier, this is sort of the midline of the cerebellum, the little brain that's beneath the bigger brain, basically, and it does posture and lip movement and eye movement. We see the right lateral cerebral hemisphere, the right lateral occipital gyri, pattern recognition, early visual detection for facial processing. Maybe that this is the right lateral occipital gyri, which gyri, by the way, is the protrusion or the ridge, right, on top of a fold in the brain, with the sulcus is the actual fold, crevice. And this is early visual detection for face processing. So when we're in group flow, right, if you've read Stealing Fire, and the Navy SEALs are reacting very quickly to everybody's twitch and turn, or in Rise of Superman in the group flow chapter where the skydivers are jumping off a building in Chicago, the base jumpers are jumping off a building in Chicago, and they're reading kind of each other's movements and micro expressions and tiny gestures and things like that. This portion of the brain, hyperactive, may speed that up and may allow that. All right, so we've worked our way through all the stuff that gets activated in flow. Let's talk about what gets deactivated. What did Charles Limb discover was deactivated? The big one, you've heard me talk about this, I'm sure, is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is the part, dorsolateral, upper side prefrontal cortex, right? So the upper outside parts of the prefrontal cortex, so the outsides of your forehead, basically. This is houses some of the structures for negative self-talk. So when the inner critic goes away, this portion of the brain shuts down. It also is tied to the ACC, does some error detection. So we probably lose some of our ability to detect errors when we're in flow. Maybe we don't need it because we're so good at what we're doing when we're in flow. Don't know yet, but it's interesting. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does some other stuff that is interesting. Handles working memory, and especially goal-related working memory. So you're trying to hold on to something because you got to do something. This portion of the brain does that. It's planning, selective attention, temporal integration, and volition. There's a willpower, rule encoding, which might actually get automatized consciously, and then the rules get played back, right? We do temporal order and planning and inhibition here. A part of the brain that is involved in risky decision making and moral decision making. Right? This is one of the reasons we take more risks in flow. By the way, that awful sound in the background is my big dog drinking water, and there's nothing I can do to stop him, so we're just going to let him keep going, and I apologize for that. That's the problem when you run a dog sanctuary, I guess. So we take more risks in flow, and morality is shut down, right? Everybody going back all the way to Maslow and Csikszentmihalyi pointed out that flow is morally neutral, right? Soldiers in war get into flow. Murderers can get into flow, right? One of the reasons it's morally neutral is because this part of the brain is shut down. So this is interesting. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex also forms associations between things that are separated in time. And this is weird because you would think that these kinds of associations might be radically amplified in flow, part of that heightened creativity we get, but instead it's shut off. I don't think that's really well understood. So the part of the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, so we talked about how the medial prefrontal cortex really activated in flow. Part that's shut down is the dorsal, the upper part. This is interesting because this is a part of the brain that is responsible for what's called negative valence tagging of incoming stimuli, which basically means something comes into your field of attention and it's dangerous or scary, right? And if the danger and the scariness is not kind of an amygdala reaction, so a baseline hardwired fear, if it requires more meaning making to get to the scary, right, then this is the part of the brain that's activated, right? So if you see a squiggly shape in the grass and you jump back before you've had time to realize stick, not snake, that's your amygdala. If you see a guy walking towards you and you start to realize he's dressed a lot like a Russian mobster and there seems to be a bulge under it, right? That sort of thing where you're making meaning, right? That's more this part of the brain. Of course, it's very sort of tied to the ACC, right? This is error correction, meaning where meaning gets attached to error correction. And we see in depression, we see a lot of hyperconnectivity with these circuits. So one of the reasons flow may be such a huge emotional lift is this portion of the brain goes away. We also see, as I mentioned earlier, the lateral orbital frontal cortex shutting down, the LOFC as it's referred to. And this is responsible for adapted goal-directed behavior. So it encodes a lot of decision-making variables, primary rewards and secondary cues that allow us to predict primary rewards, like there's a rustle in the bushes and you predict that there's going to be a boar there that you're hunting for dinner, right? This is not exactly clear why this is shut down in flow, but we also know that it's linked to mood and depression. And oddly, if you stimulate this portion of the brain with a moderate electric current for about 3 minutes, you can really lift mood. This portion of the brain inhibits risky behavior. One of the reasons risk-taking goes up in flow. And it also does first impression judgments in social situations. So one of the reasons flow may enhance pro-social behavior, because those snap judgments we're making to about people, the negative ones that we come to really, really quickly before we had time to get to know folks, that's this portion of the brain. right? The amygdala shuts down, right? We often talk about this as the fear center of the brain, which it is, but it does a lot of really basic primary emotions. The entorhinal cortex is shut down. This is memory and navigation and time perception, the creation of memory for spatial learning patterns, like navigating to a remembered location. And it also does episodic memory, what happened first, second, third. The thing is, if it's suppressed, we think just maybe it allows you to form new patterns, right? It allows you to break free from old habits and maybe optimize for novelty. So one of the things that I hope is clear by now, I've been talking for a while, is that there are trade-offs in flow, right? We're losing critical faculties as much as we're gaining other faculties. There's definitely stuff that is being shut down. And I think as we get deeper and deeper and deeper into this research over the next decade or two, we're going to start to get a really better picture of this stuff. We also see deactivation of the temporal pole. This is the very front and the bottom of the brain. It sort of juts out right in front of the amygdala. It's not really well understood. We know it's involved in social and emotional processing, including both facial recognition and theory of mind, right? What another is thinking. And if you in horrific animal experiments, can't stand the fact that people do this stuff, but if you do this, you get social withdrawal. So you cut this area out of monkeys and they pull back, but you also get a diminished fear response. So again, less fear and flow, this might be one of the reasons. So another portion of the brain that is shut down is the posterior cingulate cortex, right? This is the other side of the ACC. The ACC is activated, the PCC is shut down. This is interesting. Being present, centered, and attention, being on task, is associated with decreases in the posterior cingulate cortex. So exactly what we see in flow. Judson Brewer at Yale found that this part of the brain is deactivated by meditation. But it's actually activated when we're caught up in an experience, a particular point of view, like functional fixedness or going with the crowd, right? So when this is deactivated, we may end up with more novelty. It also integrates self-location with body ownership, which is a really weird way of saying, and they figured this out at the Karolinska Institute, where they've done tons of great flow research as well, that you can produce out-of-body experiences here. This is autobiographical memories, right? Shut this down and maybe get more novelty. Things like that, but really not totally understood. But what we do know is that, interestingly, they often say that the PCC and the MPFC, right? PCC is deactivated in flow, MPFC is activated in flow, and these two things together form a rudimentary sense of self. So one of the reasons self disappears in flow, part of it is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, part of it is the PCC. All right, couple more things to talk about. The parahippocampi gyri. This is the gray matter that surrounds the hippocampus and parts of the limbic system, and it's shut down. And it's really important in memory encoding and retrieval, right? Remembering environmental scenes or contextual associations. So, oh, there's a cow, there must be a farm nearby, right? It seems to link scene perception with episodic memory, and does some emotional processing and emotional understanding and expectations from the environment, right? It's an area that we see really activated in expertise. So chess players. So why is it deactivated in flow? I don't have a clue. I don't think anybody has a clue. This one is weird and it's a mystery, and that's why this podcast is called More Questions Than Answers. We also see the hippocampus, right? Hippocampus, for those of you guys who don't know, is Greek for seahorse, because it looks like a seahorse, and it's part of the limbic system, and it regulates smell and spatial coding and memory, and it helps us decide which short-term memories are important to become long-term memories, and does a bunch of memory consolidation. Deactivation may allow us to focus on a single item, but it seems to do something about temporal ordering, to control like the temporal ordering of memory, right? What happened first, second, third when you're storing something as memory. And maybe its deactivation has something to do with time vanishing, but like the parahippocampal gyri, I don't think we have a clue what the hippocampus is doing in flow and why it's deactivated. And we also see the hypothalamus, right? The almond structure right above the brainstem that does homeostasis and hormone release, and it regulates a lot of the autonomic nervous system and controls temperature, hunger, thirst, fatigue, sleep, heart rate, digestion, perspiration. By the way, and a lot of hormones, right? The hypothalamus is essentially the four F's: fighting, fleeing, fornicating, and feeding, right? And this may be part of the diminished fear response, but we don't know. And the truth of the matter is, now that I have just worked our way through everything that Lim found, activated and deactivated in flow, and you've been listening to brain structures for 30 minutes, if you're still tuned in, you get how much we really don't actually know about flow, because we can list all these things, right? And oh, cool, but we don't even really quite know how they work together in a network function. And some of these ideas conflict with some earlier ideas. There's ways to go. But what's really, really cool to me about this kind of analysis is how clearly you can see a lot of the phenomenology in flow, the stuff that happens to you in the experience that seems totally mysterious, totally mystical, totally weird, and yet we can link it back to brain structure, at least a little bit. And I think that's really amazing and really interesting. And we're going to do more of this kind of deep dive next month. But for now, if you want to go deeper with us, the best place to go is to check out our training, Zero to Dangerous, an introduction to flow hacking. In this training, we're going to build on a bunch of the neuroscience that I just walked you guys through, learning how to make it practical and actionable. We'll expand on it as well, and we're going to fill in a lot of details. We're going to talk about what positive psychologists have taught us about hacking flow. We're going to work our way through flow's 22 triggers, breaking down the neurobiology of each and how to apply each in your life. We're going to do the same with the flow cycle. This is everything you need to make flow a reliable, repeatable experience in your life. And of course, on the other side, you get all the stuff that more flow brings with it automatically, right? Massively heightened productivity and motivation, accelerated learning, amplified creativity and learning, all the heightened social bonding, collaboration, cooperation stuff you get from group flow, and a whole lot more. So if this is your kind of thing, just check out the Zero to Dangerous link at the bottom, schedule an interview with one of my team, just sign up. Somebody will get back to you within 24 hours and get on the phone with you and figure out if you're right for this and what you need to get going. And we mean what we say. The course is called Zero to Dangerous for a reason. Doesn't really matter where you start. You're going to come out the other side pretty dangerous. We've been using standard kind of flow psychometric instruments. We've been measuring pre and post for a little while now. We're seeing an 80% increase in flow on the back end of this training. That's a huge boost. It's making a huge difference in people's lives. And you can have some too. So check it out if it's right for you. If not, I'll catch you next month. Stephen Kotler out.